I can squat. There we go. Thanks. Are we ready to go? Can you hear me? Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Bob Costanza. I'm director of the Institute for Sustainable Solutions, and welcome to our Sustainable Solutions seminar series. There we go. This is the first in our weekly series. If you go online on our website, you'll see some of the other upcoming speakers. And tonight we're very pleased and honored to have Jennifer Allen as our speaker. I'll introduce her in 1 second after I get through a few announcements. The Institute for Sustainable Solutions is relatively new. I guess it was started by Jennifer 3 years ago as the Center for Sustainable Processes and Practices, and we changed the name last year. We're trying to focus more on how to solve some of the wicked problems that our society is now facing. We're also going to be broadcasting this live as a webinar. So those of you out there on the web, if you have questions, go ahead and send those in, and we'll read some of those off to the speaker later, so you can join the discussion. After the talk, we'll have time for some questions. So we would ask you to come up to the microphone and ask those questions. Not that we can't hear you in the room, but if we're broadcasting this, we need you on the mic. And we're also going to have some refreshments after the talk. So stay for those, and you can ask more questions during during that time. And the students that are signed up for the course, we're also offering this as a 4-credit seminar course. See Shapressa here over after the course, just to orient you a bit after that. Okay, I think that's all I have for announcements. Let me introduce Jennifer then. Jennifer Allen is an associate professor in the Public Administration Department, and she's also a fellow of the Institute for Sustainable Solutions, and she's also interim associate director of the Institute for Sustainable Solutions. So her recent paper on transitioning Oregon to safer chemicals was featured on OPB's Think Out Loud, and is one of the focal points of this important discussion happening statewide and hopefully worldwide, and that's going to be the topic of her talk this evening. Last week she testified in front of the Oregon Senate Committee on Environment and Natural Resources about this topic, and she currently serves on the boards of the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, the Illahee Foundation. She's a member of the Multnomah County Advisory Committee on Sustainability and Innovation, and she's previously worked at the World Bank, at EcoTrust, at the Oregon Economic and Community Development Department. So she's been around, and she's done a lot of things, a lot of different things, and I think they all bear on this goal that we have of finding sustainable solutions to some of these problems. She has degrees from Yale and the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and I think your PhD was from George Mason University. So tonight she's going to talk about moving towards safer chemicals, Oregon's opportunity for leadership. Let's welcome Jennifer Allen.
Thank you, Bob, for that nice introduction, and welcome everyone tonight. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience, and it's really nice to see faces that I don't know in the audience. I hope to get a chance to know you all this evening through your questions. The instructions for the Solutions Seminar Series are that they really want us to spend time on the solutions. So I'm going to start off sort of framing the context for you, help you understand what the challenges are related to chemical policy and our management of toxic chemicals. But then I want to turn quickly to some of the ideas we have about what can be done to address some of these challenges. And it's really, I think a lot of the solutions are things which everybody has a chance to get engaged in. So hopefully this will give you some ideas on that front, and I really am looking forward to your questions and discussion about this because there still are a lot of questions, okay? I have some ideas, but I think we all need to engage in really defining what some of the answers are. So first, just some acknowledgments. This report, which came out in June, is called Leadership in Sustainable Chemicals Policy, Opportunities for Oregon. And I worked on it with another Portland State colleague, Alexis Dino, who is an assistant professor in community health. And it was also funded by a number of agencies, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Human Services, Metro, and the National Association for the Hazardous Materials Management. I actually spoke to their conference earlier this afternoon about this. So a lot of appreciation for the folks that provided resources to fund this project. I also think it indicates the breadth of interest in this topic, that these groups stepped up and came together to really figure out how we could move this discussion forward, and I think that's a great sign. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, first, again, give you a little bit of the current context that we're facing for chemicals management, talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities related specifically to three issue areas, the data, the safety, and the technology gaps that we face right now, but then again, want to spend most of my time talking about some possible steps we can take to address some of these challenges. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that when I use the term sustainable, I really am referring to things which try to integrate the social, the environmental, and the economic aspects of a situation and really move forward in a way that integrates them and comes up with a solution that's really going to address things on all those fronts. And that's a really central part of this report. I think we really need to move beyond just thinking about the environmental issues or the social issues or the economic issues as if they're separate, which is really the way we're organized. And so some of my suggestions are really ways to look at how can we make this an economically competitive opportunity for Oregon's businesses and really align our regulatory policies, our incentives toward things that can also make us economically competitive. So again, succeeding on the social, the environmental, and the economic front as best we can in an integrated way. So first a quiz. It is the first week of school, and I am a professor. So my first question to you is approximately how many chemicals are currently in use? Anybody have any idea? I'm going to give you actually a multiple choice. I figured I'd make it a little bit easier for you. Are there approximately 10,000, 46,000, 84,000, 110,000 chemicals in use? Anybody know? Raise your hand. Yeah? I cheated because I read your paper. 84,000. What do you think? 10,000. Okay. 84,000. She read the paper. You did your homework. Excellent. So that's a lot, right? There are a lot of chemicals out there in use, okay? This is the trend that we expect to see in terms of chemicals entering industrial and commercial use over time. We're at 2010, which is way over here on this side. That's like 3 bars over. And it's expected to continue to grow at a rate of about 3% a year going forward. So we got a lot in use. We're going to have more, okay? How many of these chemicals do you think the Environmental Protection Agency has assessed for their environmental and health impacts? Once again, I'm doing multiple choice, trying to start the term off gently. None? 200, 2,500, 22,000, 84,000, and no, you can't answer, Veronica. You say 2,500? Do we have any other bids? You say 22,000? Anybody else? Approximately 200. Yeah. So here, this is a challenge, right? We've got a lot of things we're using, and we don't know a whole lot about very many of them, okay? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we're in that situation where we really only know some things comprehensively about a relatively small number of these chemicals. The situation, the context we're in, we lack information about chemical impacts, and we also significantly underinvest in coming up with safer alternatives, okay? So that's kind of a two-part challenge. We've also got a regulatory structure that's very fragmented. It involves a lot of different agencies. They're not very well coordinated, and it's also very reactive, okay? So we're chasing those 84,000 chemicals, right? We're chasing after them, as opposed to being proactive, and I'm going to talk about what proactive might look like. And again, we're chasing what we don't want instead of creating what we do want, right? So we're trying to go and figure out what the problems are with all these chemicals. And that's the way our system's set up. That's what it tells us to do. It doesn't point us in the direction of saying, what do we really want that's positive? What do we want that's safe? What kind of an environmental quality do we want? And how can we really pursue that as opposed to chasing the things that we don't want, okay? So those are kind of the overarching themes that we'll be trying to address as we go forward. So again, the current context has these three elements that make it particularly challenging. A data gap. We don't have enough information, right? Related to that, a safety gap. We really aren't doing a very good job of protecting our health and the environment, and those are linked, the data and the safety gap. And a technology gap, which is we're not really investing in alternatives to the things that we don't like. So I'm going to go into each of these in a little more detail. So the data gap. The fact of the matter is it would be virtually impossible for us to gather sufficient information about the impacts of all those chemicals that I mentioned, the 84,000. Why is it so difficult? Anybody have ideas about what might be some of the reasons that it's so difficult for us to actually gather this information? Lack of resources. Okay, that's a good one. Anything else? Confidentiality. Okay, there are a lot of rules and regulations out there that say that businesses don't have to share information, right? That it's confidential business information. Hank? All right, so people don't really want to share information about what they have, right? Because we're really set up to and there's disincentives on that front. You guys are good. So the fact of the matter is the current regulatory situation is set up so that unless we can show that there's clear evidence of harm, companies can basically produce and use chemicals as they see fit, okay? So we don't have access to the information to show there's evidence of harm because the companies don't give it to us, but without getting that evidence, they can basically do what they want, okay? So it's set up in a really funny way that we, the agencies, have to show that there's actual impact in order to ban a chemical, as opposed to having to show that it's safe before you can use it. Europe's approached it in a completely different way, where the burden is on the companies to show something safe before they can use it. Here, agencies have to show there's harm before they can prevent someone from using it. And there's few incentives for companies to want to go provide that information, right? Because if a company said, well, gee whiz, I think I'll look into this thing that I'm using and see if it actually has any impacts, and then they go, oh my gosh, it does, well, that means that probably somebody's going to come and say you can't use it anymore. So there's really no incentive for a company to want to develop that information. The other aspects you've talked about, just the raw numbers, 84,000, and we don't put a lot of resources into it, okay? But another part of this challenge is just the nature of chemicals, okay? Because when you think about it, these are some of the attributes of the chemicals we use, okay? They accumulate in food, they accumulate in human tissue, they combine in ways we don't predict, right? And they flow. They flow downstreams, they flow downwind, they flow between land and water, and between different classes of products, right? So you might put water in a bottle and drink the water, or pour the water out of the bottle, and things are flowing. And just pause for a minute and think about, how do you test one chemical for its environmental and health impacts considering all these things? It's a big challenge, right? Because how many different places could a chemical be used, and how many different places could it show up, and how many different ways could it combine with other chemicals? So really, we're facing a big challenge here. The other next gap is the safety gap. And this is related to the data gap in many ways, okay? As I mentioned before, the burden of proof is on agencies to prove harm without actually having access to information to show it. Because we have that lack of transparency, we don't really know which chemicals pose risk, or we don't know which ones are safer, okay? So the data gap flows right into a safety gap, which means we're not really providing sufficient protection for our health and the environment. And then the other aspect of the safety gap is that there are a lot of health disparities. So again, different things affect different groups of people in different ways. Kids are affected differently from adults, right? Elderly are affected differently from kids. People in different occupations are affected differently. You're beginning to get a sense maybe that this is complicated, right? So in my classes, actually, just about every class I've taught at Portland State, my students come to the consensus that the tagline should be, it's complicated. And this is complicated. And then the technology gap, finally, is this disconnect between where safer chemicals are needed and where we're actually investing in creating those safer chemicals, okay? We have activity. We have a lot of people working on developing safer alternatives. But there's not really any system that aligns where our biggest concerns are with where our research and development money is going, where our universities are spending their time. So again, there's a disconnect in investment in this area. There are a couple reasons for that. Once again, going back to the data and the safety gap, there's really little incentive for a manufacturer to develop an alternative, right? Our system isn't telling them that they have to provide information about the problems with what they use, so why would they spend their time and effort developing safer alternatives in many cases? It also can be costly, right? If you're going to spend time as a business developing alternatives when there really isn't necessarily a proven market for it. We don't have enough public and private investment into green chemistry research and other kinds of things, technical assistance. And there's this information technology gap, which I think is another aspect of the technology gap, which really is that lack of information flow, which is in itself something that makes this quite challenging. So I just briefly want to touch on what is green chemistry. Okay, in the last slide, I mentioned that we don't invest enough in green chemistry, so what is that? It's a field of chemistry which has developed that allows us to really look at how we design products and processes in ways that are not toxic and that are safer for the environment and human health, okay? And it's important to recognize this was a field that didn't really exist when a lot of the regulations that were passed 35 years ago that we're currently working with came into place. Okay, so it's a whole new opportunity for us that isn't reflected in the regulations we have. But what it allows us to do, the kind of knowledge you have in the field of green chemistry, is to say, what do we want, right? How do we design products or chemicals or alternatives that we know because of how we've designed them, they're going to be safer for our health and for the environment. So this has been an emerging opportunity, as this field has grown. And this is where we really don't yet have sufficient investment to really take advantage of what this field offers us. Oregon, coming to the opportunities for Oregon, one of the reasons I think this state has a real chance to be a leader is that we have tremendous bench strength in green chemistry. The University of Oregon in particular, but working through Oregon Best with other universities here, is recognized nationally as being a leader in green chemistry. Jim Hutchison, who's a professor at the University of Oregon, again, is known as one of the leading thinkers in this area. This is a comment by the Assistant Administrator of EPA's Office of Research and Development, which I'll just let you read. But essentially what it's pointing out is that, once again, we're recognized nationally as having been out in the front and really pushing opportunities in green chemistry. So this is one reason that we're positioned well. I'm going to come back to some of our other assets shortly. So the big question that this report attempted to look at was, given these challenges that I just shared with you, do we have opportunities to really align our policies and our investments toward a better future? Are there ways we can address some of these gaps in ways that will result in a safer environment, a healthier environment, and again, that ideally would also provide some economic opportunity in the process? And is this a way that we can get away from the constant, very slow, very painful process of pursuing a chemical by chemical ban, pursuing, the whack-a-mole approach, as many people call it, when you realize, gee, something seems to be a problem. Let's go spend a lot of time and effort getting rid of that and fighting about it and trying to get rid of it when we're really not addressing the broader issue, okay? So I'm not saying that we should stop trying to restrict the use or eliminate the use of things that are problematic for health or environmental reasons. We need to keep doing that. But can we do it in such a way that we're aligning those efforts with efforts toward alternatives, and that we're doing it in a more coordinated and integrated way rather than just chasing opportunities in a sort of a non-strategic, incremental manner? And there's a business imperative for this too, actually. If you look at Europe, Europe is way ahead of us on this. As I mentioned earlier, they've already shifted the burden to say that industry needs to show that a product is safe if they're going to be allowed to use it, okay? So that's shifting an enormous amount of the resources toward finding alternatives that are going to be safer. There are a number of regulations that they've passed. The ROS is focused on electronics, which again said in that particular sector we're going to be eliminating certain kinds of materials. It created a huge market push in the electronics industry globally. Because all of a sudden, if you want to sell computers in the European Union, you're going to need to start paying attention to these regulations. REACH is another one that, again, is prioritizing chemicals that they're no longer going to allow in their products in the European Union. This is creating a great deal of pressure on any company that functions internationally, okay? And, there's some local examples, too, of businesses that have really stepped up and gained a competitive advantage by being leaders in terms of looking at safer alternatives in their products. Some local ones, Nike has done a tremendous amount of work in this area, and they've led an effort called the Green Exchange, where they're working with others in the apparel industry to say, how do we work together to develop alternatives? Columbia Forest Products is another, Blount Industries. And so the question again is, if we have this growing business pressure or pressure on businesses to begin to move in this direction, can we turn it around and make that an opportunity by looking at the way we align what we're doing in this state? So here's some actions that I think are worth considering that may help us move in that direction. First of all, develop a shared set of priorities and goals across state agencies. And again, I'm going to come back and go into these in a little more detail. Create a mechanism that will really allow us to align our resources between areas where we have great concern and then areas where we're really trying to develop safer alternatives. It happens, but it doesn't necessarily happen strategically, and we don't necessarily have alignment between priority concerns and the development of alternatives. What can we do to do a better job of developing and disseminating information? Because information can drive markets, right? The more people know, the more they're likely to take that information and have it shape the decisions about what they buy in the marketplace. Right now, we don't really have that happening in terms of the chemicals that are in our products. And then I think also, and this isn't just because I work at a university, but I think that there's a real need to really expand our education and workforce development programs. Because if we're thinking about how Oregon as a state can be competitive in this, we really need to be thinking about how do you build the expertise and the knowledge and the skills in everything from small businesses to our major sectors, wood products, apparel, whatever it might be, electronics, so that people actually have the skills that can help them work as teams to shift their products from using things which are of concern to us as a society toward developing and using products and substances that are in fact going to be safer for us going forward. So with respect to the first action, shared goals, right now, I'll come to a slide in a minute, there's a large number of agencies in Oregon that hold on to different parts of the chemical management elephant, okay? They have different responsibilities in terms of management, regulation, control, monitoring, storage, but we don't really have a framework where they can share their priorities and identify where the common areas of concern are and where they can align their efforts so that if one agency has a policy that, say, is trying to move us in a particular direction, that other agencies are aligning their efforts to support that policy, right? Or at least other agencies aren't, implementing policies that pull the lever in the other direction, right? So an example might be, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has done a great job of developing a toxics reduction strategy for its own agency. Historically, within Department of Environmental Quality, the efforts within the land program, the water program, the air program were disconnected. So the people working on land issues might be chasing certain priorities, water might be chasing different priorities, air might be chasing other priorities. This strategy actually says, wait, looking across media, given how chemicals work, what is our comprehensive toxic reduction strategy? And again, toxic reduction is about reducing the stuff we use up front, right? So it's moving upstream, saying let's not use this stuff in the first place. But that strategy doesn't include other state agencies right now. So while DEQ is doing a good job of internally integrating its work, it's not a strategy that's necessarily shared by Health and Human Services or Occupational Safety and Health or Agriculture or Forestry or anybody else. So if you just begin to say, how can we create a framework that's going to allow us to leverage our resources and focus on shared priorities, right there you can begin to move toward some better solutions and better outcomes. Just one example would be the fire marshal's office. major role it plays in this area is that it levies the fees on people who store chemicals. Okay? So if you're storing chemicals, you pay a fee to the Office of the Fire Marshal. That fee structure doesn't in any way encourage someone to use safer chemicals. So you pay a fee. It doesn't matter if it's hugely toxic or it's not so toxic. Well, that seems like a place you could say, how do we align that policy in a way that maybe we're steering people away from the things that we know we don't want, right? And maybe toward things that we do. This is just one, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but it just sort of shows you across the top state agencies and then the different types of roles they play with respect to chemicals in different manner. You could see why a little more coordination and communication and alignment might be helpful in terms of making sure that people working on one aspect of chemical policy, again, are aligning with the efforts of others. I think the other benefit, if you just talk about alignment across state agencies, is it's a good government initiative, right? It helps people look at government agencies and say, we're using our resources effectively, we're aligning what we do, we're not working at cross purposes. And even for folks that are regulated, often they would rather have a one-stop understanding that, yes, I'm meeting everybody's requirements rather than having to do it statute by statute, agency by agency, permit by permit, okay? So the other way of looking at this is that it's a way to make it easier for businesses to actually meet some of the requirements that we ask of them. The second area, again, is I think where we can align and incent in different ways. I think we can focus resources on developing safer alternatives for our major industries here, okay? What are their needs? What do they use that we're concerned about? And how do we really not just chase after those things, but help bring resources to the table so that they can have safer alternatives and keep themselves in business? To create a mechanism that really, again, pushes and pulls at the same time. If we're focusing on creating a demand for safer chemicals through markets or through purchasing policies, are we aligning that with investments in creating greater supply of safer alternatives? And again, to invest in green chemistry research and development. We have a lot of assets to build on here. We have the Oregon Sustainable Built Environment Research Consortium, which is part of Oregon BEST, working on a lot of the green building areas. We've got ONAMI, which has a strong green chemistry focus. All of these two, Oregon BEST and ONAMI, are specifically looking at how do you take research and help commercialize it? So how do you take the assets we have in our universities and then help businesses use that in order to make them more effective and competitive? We've already got infrastructure for this. The Green Product Design Network. Recently, the Center for Sustainable Materials, which is a University of Oregon and Oregon State, got a $20 million grant to advance some of their green chemistry work in this area. So again, we've got a lot to build on here. But right now, there's nothing that connects these in a strategic way to what we as a state have identified as our priority concerns. Okay? So again, this is the opportunity. How do we create a better connection between these two conversations? I think this pretty much says what I just said, but if we can actually look at specific sectors, and different sectors need different things. So high tech, green building, agriculture, timber, they're all going to have different needs in terms of the kinds of chemicals they use, the kind of processes they have. But in each of those cases, what are those needs, and how do you link it up to the researchers, to the funding opportunities that can help meet those needs? And this is, again, just trying to show you what alignment might look like if we set our statewide priorities, and if we think, how do each of our policies and programs support those priorities, and how does our research and development similarly support those priorities and feed into those programs, we're going to have a better solution. Right now, I think you'd see something that looked much more like some kind of a oddly shaped star pointing in all sorts of different directions in terms of how things are lined up. I think some other things that we can do here in the state and that we need to do if we're going to be successful here is we need to support small businesses, okay? The examples I mentioned earlier, Nike, Blount, Columbia Forest Products, most of them are pretty large businesses, not huge, but large enough to have their own resources to start exploring some of these things. We're a small business state. We have, in terms of numbers and employment, we are mostly small business. And it's small businesses that have the most difficult time exploring alternatives, looking at alternatives, knowing what their choices are, and knowing why they might want to make a different choice. So again, if we can align some of the resources that I showed you in our universities, specifically with the needs of small businesses, develop decision tools, how do they assess what their alternatives might be. I think that will be critically important. I think we need to mobilize capital resources. We've got some commercialization grants through Oregon Best. What else can we do with venture, with capital, with angel funding to try to, again, incent innovation and help develop new alternatives? I think another type of alignment is to really look closely, and we're already doing this in many cases, but at what other states are doing, okay? So I've been somewhat Oregon-centric, but the opportunity really is to say, where's the leadership in other states? What are they pursuing, and how can we align what we're doing here in Oregon and work closely with other states? This is particularly important for things like consumer products, which are manufactured in many different places that cross state lines constantly. Very hard for any one state to effectively regulate consumer products globally. But a lot of states are doing things in this area: Washington, Maine, California. What can Oregon do to both become part of those initiatives and then potentially particularly have a regional impact if we look at looking at Washington and California? The third area has to do with information. And this has to do with collecting information and disseminating information. We do some monitoring in this state, but once again, are we targeting that to the areas where the risks are greatest and where our concerns are greatest? In many cases, we probably are. But I think it's worth sort of making sure that both, again, we can align across agencies and get better coordination there. Labeling of consumer products is another one. Washington State's done some interesting work in this area where now companies selling products in that state have to disclose on those products, certain kinds of ingredients. And that's, again, creating some interesting dynamics in terms of the companies that want to be selling products in Washington State. One of the areas I think is particularly interesting to me is the opportunity to work with certification programs. There are a lot of certification programs out there like Food Alliance, EPEAT for electronics, many others. Why don't we look at what our state priorities are, what we're trying to stop using, where we'd like to push people toward using other things, and work with the certification programs to say if you incorporate these requirements, a business then gets market recognition for being certified. At the same time, it knows it's meeting regulatory requirements and really advancing the state's priority areas. So it becomes a win-win. It's a voluntary program, but by aligning it better with our priorities, it could really move the needle. Going back to agency coordination, I think having a coordinated information system across agencies. Right now, if an agency is developing information about something, it's not necessarily a given that another agency would have access to that information. So you often would have people either reinventing the wheel, trying to collect information about the same sorts of things, or just simply not knowing that another agency already has some knowledge that might be helpful. So what can we do to create a better flow of information across our state agencies so they can better coordinate their work? And then expanding public awareness of chemicals. And then there are many strategies for that. Eco-certification could be one, labeling is another. I think there are many ways that we can just create awareness. And the importance of that really has to do with the market push. If consumers are more aware of what the concerns are, they're more likely to include consideration of chemicals in their purchasing policies. Finally, education and training. I think that the importance of this really has to do with, for the state of Oregon, really thinking long-term about how we want to be leaders in this area. It's not just a matter of looking at what our current concerns are. What do we know we're worried about right now, and what do we do about finding an alternative? It's about training people to be able to look systemically at situations and to be able to diagnose and design things in ways that are ultimately going to be safer and are going to be competitive in the long run because they're asking the right questions up front. So for that reason, we need not just chemists to be educated about green chemistry. We need business students, marketing students, all of them to understand what this means and what the opportunity is. Why is it worth thinking about, investing in some of these things that we know inherently are going to be safer if it's a business risk? What is the long-term benefit to us as a business in that? How does it help us be competitive? But again, preparing them to address the challenges we don't even know we have right now, okay? And I think that that's the long-term opportunity for the state. Berkeley's done a lot of really great stuff already on this front. Another idea that emerged was having interdisciplinary internship programs where you might take a business student, a chemistry student, and an engineering student and give them a shared internship in a business that's trying to figure this out. And so then you give students the opportunity to get hands-on experience solving these problems, working with students from other disciplines. And again, I think the outreach to small businesses is another critically important area. They're likely to get blindsided by this, okay? When Staples, which is already actively looking at its supply chain and saying, we don't want any toxic, we're trying to get rid of a lot of the toxic stuff that's in our supply chain, when they start driving that down, a lot of their suppliers are smaller businesses. And if they don't see this coming, they're going to be out of business, right? So we have a responsibility to help small businesses, again, start to look upstream and figure out what could they be doing to position themselves to respond to these larger supply chain pressures that are happening. So again, I said I have probably more questions than answers. I think some of the next questions really are, if there's interest in Oregon in pursuing this, where should we direct our resources and our funds to develop a more comprehensive chemical policy? What are some of the specific actions that we need to take? How do you bring agencies together effectively? It sounds easy, probably. It's like, just get them to talk to each other. Anybody who has worked in an agency knows it's not quite that easy, right? When I was talking to the Senate committee last week, this came up because, they're considering a comprehensive chemical policy. And the fact of the matter is you need to make sure that department directors, boards, and commissions are going to reward their staff for actually spending time talking to other agencies about how their programs relate to each other. That doesn't always happen. I actually had my knuckles rapped when I worked at the Economic Development Department for going and talking to the Department of Forestry. Because they're like, they're the Department of Forestry. What do they have to do with economic development? I said, well, a few things. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a culture necessarily that supports this kind of collaboration and communication. So that's a pretty major, thing we need to address. Which specific actors do we need to invite to the table to work on this? Is it all state agencies? Is it some state agencies that are willing to step out, and be leaders in this area? How do we set that table, and who do we invite? Who in industry is interested in this? Are there leaders in industry who are ready to sit down and say, okay, let's start talking about our priorities. Let's start talking about how we align this. Let's maybe take some risks, and I'll let you know what I'm using, and we'll see what we can do about it, okay? So who can we pull in as champions on that front? And again, what motivates people to work together? What are the meaningful things that will actually get people to be willing to explore some of these solutions? So I'm interested in what your ideas, too, are in terms of addressing this. I think I'm going to wrap it there. There's just some references, and I wanted to thank you. So I'd love to take your questions and your ideas. Thanks.
So questions, come up to the microphone, please. Maybe while you're thinking about it, I could ask a couple. I'd like to know a little bit more about the European system and how they've changed the burden of proof. And maybe have you thought about this idea of requiring financial assurance bonds to companies, when they issue or produce a new chemical that somehow shift the burden and require them to, bear the financial responsibility for what might go wrong. So that idea is.
Tell me more about a financial insurance bond.
This is, require companies to post a bond before they are allowed to release a chemical that's large enough to cover the worst case scenario. And I think we're better at coming up with the worst case scenario than we are with coming up what exactly is going to happen. And then they can recover that bond if and when the results are shown to be less than what might go wrong. That's going to force them to think a lot more critically about what it is that they're doing and how big the potential risks are, and it's certainly going to move the economic incentives in the right direction. And I think the European system is doing that sort of with a regulatory system. This would be a way to do a more economic incentive approach to that. And you might also think, you're talking about the trying to get state agencies to cooperate, and I know that the Oregon Solutions Center has just moved into our building over in the Market Center building, and they have representatives from several state agencies all sitting in the same room with the mandate to talk to each other. So we'll see how that works. I'm not sure if there's anybody here from that group tonight, but maybe you could say a little bit more about if you think that's going in the right direction. Okay.
I guess picking up on a couple of those things, maybe starting with the second one first. I specifically mentioned the idea of thinking about this in an Oregon Solutions framework, which is how do you bring together all the players that need to be part of a solution and get them to agree to what they need to do to move that forward. And I think that's a great framework, and I think the Regional Solutions Center is a good place to be thinking about that. I was also going to say, too, I think one of the reasons that Oregon has an opportunity to be a leader here is that we also have a culture of public-private partnerships that you don't see in a lot of other states, where it's not that unusual for the private sector and the public sector to sit down and think about how they can work together in creative ways. So once again, I think making sure that you set the table to leverage those relationships. I know when Nissan and Toyota were coming to Oregon to look at did they want to do their electric vehicle pilots here, the one thing that struck them that made them, I think, tipped the balance for them was that they had never seen the public sector and the private sector work so collaboratively, and that they really didn't, it was so, inspirational to sit down and have everybody in line saying, yeah, we're willing to work together. What can we do? And I think that that's an opportunity here, is to kind of build on that culture. I think with the respect to the bond question, there's a lot of work being done. I see Lang Marsh and Hank Patton here in the room on looking at intergenerational finance frameworks, and how do we do exactly what you're saying, but and how do we institutionalize thinking so that we are thinking long term and we're creating the financial mechanisms that both incent that and reward it. So I think what you are saying is creating a bond which at least raises the awareness of responsibility in people's minds, but also pushes them toward how do they mitigate that possible downside, so they're not going to have to, pay the price of it. So I think there are a lot of creative ways, and this would be a great place to pioneer some of those. So I think that's definitely an opportunity.
So thank you, Jennifer. This has been really good. I must say I read the part about the chemicals and I was thinking, I don't know, but this is really, you've done a really nice job of pulling all of this together. The piece, and you've just been talking about it, so I may be kind of beating the dead horse, but the interagency connections and, thank you. I thought I made it low enough. The interagency relationships and all, I think we're running into that in environmental health and equity issues, and it's almost like if we could think through that at that higher level of things that you could do in that arena, things we could do in our arena, that there may be a way in which we could move some things along more rapidly that would be a really good thing. Collaborations are wonderful and challenging, but if we could start to look at some ways in which we could connect up the various agencies and build that and then duplicate that in a number of different areas, I think that would be a really great thing to achieve.
Yeah, one thing picking up on that was interesting to me when I started to work on this was to see how little connection there had been historically between people working on the public health side of things and then people working on the environmental toxicology side of things, more on the sort of natural environment side of things. And I think that's a huge opportunity. One reason I wanted to work with Alexis Dino was she brings a community health perspective, and I have more of an environmental policy perspective. But they're communities that haven't historically had as much conversation as I think we could, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah. I think so too. So thanks for the good work.
Jennifer, thank you. It was a very enjoyable presentation. I just have a very simple question. The program that the Europeans have established, the REACH program, seems to me to be a very effective way to not only evaluate chemicals currently in our system, but also any new chemicals that are brought out by some company for some purpose. What is the likelihood that in the United States we would establish a program similar to that?
Sure, it's a very good question. There have been some indications of interest in cooperation between our Environmental Protection Agency and the European organizations that are working on this to at least have some dialogue. There's also, there have been many efforts to reform our federal policy, our Toxic Substances Control Act, over in recent years, and they haven't been able to move forward, but I know that a lot of people working on those reform initiatives are hoping we can move towards something more like REACH. I have a little bit of a background in sort of comparative culture and institutions, and the European culture and institutions are phenomenally different from the American culture and institutions when it comes to taking this kind of approach where the public good drives the policy agenda. And so I think that there will be challenges politically here to doing that, but it's definitely under discussion. And the great thing I think is, an advantage of a globalized world is that we are being affected by REACH. And I think that in many ways, any companies that act internationally are having to respond to what it's doing, and that may drive the change far quicker than any changes in U.S. policy do. Sure, and I'm not a real expert on it. I might actually defer to someone like David Livengood here in the audience to talk more about it. But it's as I say, one of the big efforts was it shifted the burden to industry to show safety as opposed to having agencies having to show harm. So it creates a very different dynamic there. And then they have prioritized a number of chemicals of concern, and I'm not sure how many are on the list now, 200 some, where they're then working towards saying we are going to move to eliminating these from our products. So they actually set it out. They say these got to go away. And that sends a pretty clear signal to industry that it needs to eliminate these things. My sense is, David, they do it in a phased. I mean, they let you know what the phases are going to be. It's going to have to, you can't use this stuff after 2015. So it gives industry time to say, okay, I guess we better figure out what the alternative is. And I think that kind of framework can be very effective. I worked on some ozone depletion projects when I worked at the World Bank, and that's a similar framework which basically said we will be phasing out these substances over this period of time. And everybody stepped up and said, okay, I guess we're going to figure out what the alternative is. And I think that that's part of the framework that's really particularly effective. And the fact that it's a European-wide initiative, which means it's got some really significant markets that then come into play on that front. David, is there anything you'd want to add to that? I know you're... Nope. Okay. Anything inaccurate?
I would emphasize what you said already, Jennifer, which is simply that not only does it have an impact in the U.S., and it is most certainly happening, but it's the other countries that are part of it, because you mentioned European Union, but over in Asia is already adopting REACH as part of either their version or carte blanche of the REACH. The other part I would say, which is a subset of, you were saying has an impact, but I would go further to say it's going right down to the supply chain. So it's not just the companies themselves. Right. It's where they have to get to their suppliers, and those suppliers have to get to their suppliers. And it's that way it's having the finger effect or the spider effect within the United States, and it's most profound.
Thanks.
We have a question from our online audience. What are some success stories we can build on in Oregon or elsewhere for green chemicals R&D?
For green chemicals R&D? Okay. There's one story that's probably the best known, so I will share some others as well. Columbia Forest Products, which I'd already mentioned, a number of years ago, was interested in developing a formaldehyde-free adhesive for use in building products. So most laminated wood uses formaldehyde-based adhesives, or did. And with the whole green building effort, formaldehyde is one of those really nasty things that you don't get any points for if you use it in your green building. So Columbia Forest Products really wanted this. And an Oregon State professor, Kai-Cheng Lee, this is kind of a fun story. He worked in this area, but he was also walking along the beach one day, and he was looking at mussels. Mussels, not mussels, but mussels like the little shellfish. And he thought, how in the world do they stick to these rocks? Okay? So given his background as a chemist and a forest engineer, he started exploring that, and he, working with Columbia Forest Products, developed a formaldehyde-free adhesive, essentially modeled on biomimicry, looking at how mussels function. So that's one that positioned Columbia Forest Products very competitively in the green building industry. It actually really angered a lot of the other wood products companies because all of a sudden they were behind the 8 ball. But it was one that I think is a great example of that. I think you're seeing a lot happening in the green building industry on a lot of other products. Again, in this region, we have a concentration of expertise in that area. So from paint, you look at Miller Paint, you look at a variety of companies that have really been able to shift to less toxic, less volatile organic compounds. So that would be one of the examples that I think really stands out. There are many others. Yeah, 7th generation products Coastwide Labs is another, again, smallish Oregon business. I'm not sure how small it is anymore, but does cleaning products. And they worked with the business school here at Portland State a number of years ago when they were trying to figure out how could they shift their industry in that direction. So once again, it's not just chemistry and expertise. It's also thinking about the whole business model when you start to shift to these new opportunities. Yeah, Allison.
Another strength we have here in Oregon is the willingness of our critical mass of consumers and citizens to rally when progressive ideas and solutions are put out there, and especially to vote with our dollars when we see who and where to vote. Examples would be our great support here of small, local, sustainability-inspired businesses in that community.
Mm-hmm.
Like Burgerville, among many others. We've got so many great businesses in this region. When you put on your home consumer hat, as you've been engaged in this area of research, is there maybe a personal chemical aha you might share where, as a result of learning about it, you made a personal shift in your own home consuming, possibly something we could take on as just a first immediate call to action from this room?
Sure, it's a good question. I think some of the low-hanging fruit, once again, comes down to cleaning. There are a lot of really simple home remedy things that you can use on clothes or carpets. Talk about baking soda or soda, seltzer water. So I start there when I have one of those challenges in my own household. I'll tell you one that scares me, and unfortunately it's not really a success story yet, but I've become really alert about the stuff we put on our pets for fleas and things like that, because this may sound a little odd, but on the Think Out Loud program, when we were talking about this, that was one thing that came up on the blog, and I'm hearing it more and more and more that this is an area where we're just beginning to hear about alternatives, but it's one of those areas that, that stuff is really interesting. I'm not sure I know enough about it to say whether I do still use it, but it concerns me. I think it's one where we have a market push opportunity, given how many dogs we have in Oregon. Trying to think if there's anything else personally that I would highlight there. No, it has led to some spousal conversations that have been fairly lively in terms of some of the things that one might want to use in one's yard. I have a spouse who still seems to think that if we're using it, it must be safe. So we have some very lively discussions about that. But so we have gone to putting cat litter in the mole holes, as opposed to some of the more egregious strategies that he had. But.
Jennifer, thank you. Lang Marsh from the National Policy Consensus Center, and thanks for the plug on the Regional Solutions Center. It's a very interesting thought. I hadn't actually known that they would tackle these kinds of policy issues, but I think it's something we should talk with them about, and I'll be sure to do that. And I also wanted to give a plug, since you mentioned the intergenerational finance work that Hank Patton here will be addressing this room on the 19th of October on that subject, and I do agree it's quite relevant. I had a follow-up question on the international scale, because it seemed to me from your presentation that one of the lacks here in Oregon, and I know for a fact also in other states, is the lack of having good priorities for which chemicals or which sets of chemicals or which outcomes that we want to address. And I'm just wondering whether either presently the agencies that deal with this in Oregon have looked at the European activities and taken from that some sense of the priority chemicals or priority areas that we ought to be looking at, or do you envision that we'd have a separate process of some kind to identify those priorities? It seemed to me there would be a fairly easy thing to take what the Europeans are doing and take a good hard look at it for us.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and I'm sure that a lot of the folks in the agencies are looking at what Europe has already identified and the approach they're taking. There are also opportunities to look at other states, as I mentioned. Washington's been doing a lot in this area. California's been doing a lot in this area. And to learn to both, not start from scratch, as well as learning what's worked and what hasn't worked in terms of trying to figure out priorities and alignment. So I think, yeah, definitely. I think looking at the criteria that they're using, trying to assess, against looking at, I think one of the sort of macro lessons to take away is getting away from the chemical by chemical assessment chasing process and moving up a notch and saying we know what hazard looks like. We also know what green chemistry looks like. How do we, step back and really prioritize at a more macro level in ways that we really probably can move forward without perfect data about everything, right? We can't wait till we've got every single bit of data about every single chemical to do something. We know enough in many cases to move ahead, and I think that that's something that can be learned. We can learn from each other about that, is, what is sufficient for us to say, okay, probably an area we want to address. And I think that that's a different framework from the one that we've inherited, which really drives us to specific chemical data at the nth degree before we can do anything about it. So.
Hi. Can you speak a little bit more to the alignment of state agencies and local agencies around this issue? I mean, it seems to me that there's any number of areas of public policy where we could look to state agencies and see sort of a variegated approach to the same issue, and maybe also speak a little bit to the legislative process and if the committees are there in place to get some of this alignment moving.
Sure. I agree. This, having stronger alignment and coordination across state agencies is not something that would only be beneficial in this particular arena, because so many of the issues we face now are complex. They are cross-sector. They can rarely be addressed by any one single agency. If you think about watershed management, if you think about climate change, if you think about, really any of the kind of major issues, you need to have agencies that are working in alignment and coordination. And as I said before, it's not an easy thing to do. I think the Regional Solutions Center concept, when Kit Sauber was governor the first time, he had these community solutions teams. And again, the idea was, what's the one stop for people in a community who are trying to solve a problem? So they're not having to navigate all of the different agencies, and those agencies are required to come together and solve the problem, right? As opposed to just doing what the agencies do. And I think similarly in this case, there needs to be a call and encouragement and incentives and support for agencies to come together around solving a problem, as opposed to just worrying about what their legislative statute says they're supposed to be doing with their time, right? So I think, in terms of how do you make that happen, I think it probably might be a combination of an executive order that says thou shalt, which governors can do for state agencies, But I think it also needs to be it's going to be most successful if the boards and commissions that govern our agencies are engaged and understand why this is important. And that if that trickles down to the various levels in an agency, so staff know this is indeed something they're going to be rewarded for doing, and it's something that they need to be spending their time on. And those are...
But does the legislator have to reorganize themselves in terms of how their communities are organized?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay. So in terms of the legislative piece, I know there is interest. It's a good question. I know there is interest in at least one of the Senate committees in looking at a comprehensive chemical policy. I think a really interesting question, and I don't honestly know the answer, is what would be the other appropriate committees that you would want to get engaged if we're going to think of this not just as an environmental policy and regulatory question, but as an economic development question, right? Or a university higher ed question, That's an excellent question. I don't have the answer, but it's a really excellent one for us to pursue if we're going to be successful here.
Maybe I can ask one final question, and maybe that would be just to, can you elaborate a little bit more about getting our students and faculty involved more directly in solving these kinds of problems and maybe working together with state agencies and companies, et cetera?
Yeah, I'd mentioned before one idea that came up in the process of this discussion. I think Colin Price there and back is actually someone who floated this to me from Oregon Environmental Council. But I think the richest opportunity, both for businesses and for students, would be to, find a business that's interested but lacks its own resources to explore these opportunities, and then to think about what are the different programs that can inform a path forward. So is it business and engineering and chemistry? Is it marketing? Is it organizational development? Is it someone from an HR perspective? Because really what they need is to realign how people spend time in that business to do different things. So I think what I would say is to look for those opportunities just in terms of be it class projects where a class could take on a business or a sector and really explore what those opportunities are. I'm teaching environmental and natural resource policy this term, and one of the topics I'm giving my students to work on is, so what would a comprehensive chemical policy look like for the state of Oregon? You come to me with your best ideas, and maybe I'll invite Senator Dingfelder to come hear your class presentation. I think there are a variety of ways that you can get people engaged in generating, good solutions on this front. From the faculty standpoint, we already have, again, robust expertise in green chemistry. I think the opportunity we haven't yet leveraged is how do you bring together the different expertise from the faculty and research standpoint so that it's able to look at the economic viability, the technical viability, the manufacturing viability, the environmental impacts, the health impacts, the marketing opportunity, in a way that's really comprehensive. And I don't think we have that yet. I think places like Oregon Best really provides a structure for some of that. So another opportunity would be to say, how do we, say at Portland State, work more closely with Oregon Best and use the connections they have in the community to identify some of these project opportunities and deploy our students and our faculty on them. So some ideas. I'm sure there are many others.
Great. Well, join me in thanking Jennifer again for a fabulous talk. Remember, the students come and talk to Spressa, and I think they're about ready with the reception over here. So stay and have some things to eat and drink and continue the discussion. Thank you all, and we'll see you hopefully again here next week, same time, same place, where we have Veronica Dejean is talking next week. So, thank you.